Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Yoder.
And I'm Steve Chenoweth. And this is our paper on reflection for recovery about exam wrappers. The outline shows what we're going to be talking about. It goes through the main flow of the paper, including our approach, methodology, and results.
So just a little background, the motivation behind this. We have our kind of second programming course in object-oriented software development. Turns out students can learn Java and how to do object-oriented programming over 10 weeks, but usually not super great by the third week. So we end up having a lot of students that really struggle on that first exam. And we have really high requirements for their exam scores overall. So normally what we have to do to accommodate this is provide a makeup exam, but this creates a lot of extra work for instructors and graders. And a alternative solution that we began exploring a few years ago was to do exam wrappers, where students are able to rework exam problems to earn back partial credit, complete a reflective survey, and because we already have a grading rubric for the exam, there's not a whole lot of extra work for instructors, which is great. In terms of our specific exam wrapper we're using, what does it consist of in the survey? We have them say what did they do to prepare for it, and we give them a list of some options that they use, some of the more effective or less effective approaches, have them actually identify where they lost points and try to see if there's a pattern to it, have them explain what they learned from reworking problems, and actually put together an action plan for the future exams. So then as instructors, take a couple minutes for each of these to give them some feedback. A lot of times students indicate they, really didn't sleep well the night before, and they ended up losing points for, simple things like not reading properly. And so we might say, hey, it looks like maybe you should get some more sleep. So not a big investment, but gives them some feedback and lets them plan better.
So the research questions we studied were about the success of the exam wrappers, both statistically and from the student's perspective. And we were interested in whether the students progressed from a first exam, especially if they didn't do well, into succeeding exams, particularly the final exam, and if the exam wrappers helped improve their performance. And so we looked at a large number of students, which is something that distinguishes what we did from some previous studies where the numbers tended to always be small. And we also looked at what the students themselves said as to the gains that they had from exam wrappers. So our approach was to look at first at the statistics, and the two null hypotheses that we tested were, one, that there would be no significant difference between those who decided to do the exam wrapper and those who did not, controlling for a whole myriad of variables. And the second one was whether the top versus bottom performers would not shift in measurable ways depending on whether the exam wrapper was present. And we analyzed the students who did an exam wrapper to see how this worked out.
So we're able to collect historical data from 13 terms, and as Steve mentioned, quite a few, around 1,000 students. So we had 6 terms, and we're on a quarter system, so 6 terms where an exam wrapper was present and 7 where they weren't. And we tried to do as much as we could to control for confounding variables. This is really difficult since there are so many things that are different, but we could do things like remove the incompletes and repeat students to try to reduce some of the outliers in terms of the data. We're able to also look to standardize the scores across terms. So looking at relative performance of students in a given term. So what might have been one hard exam in one quarter and an easier one in another. If we instead did a normalization, now we can make meaningful comparisons of how students, shifted relative to the population. So one of the things, the primary thing we tried to look at was looking at exam 1 performance versus the final exam performance and looking at relative shifts. So the first null hypothesis is basically just, is there no difference in performance? So for the students that decided to do exam wrappers and those that decided not to, so it was an optional thing, And looking at our figure here, we're looking at the students that did participate. So this is the distribution of scores on exam one. And if they're right at the kind of neutral point where they're doing about in perfectly middle of the pack, and how they did afterwards. And then we have the ones that declined to participate, and we've got our kind of shift in the mean here. So this is really not surprising, right? Students that did poorly enough on the exam that they wanted to do a wrapper, they tended to do better later. They kind of had more to improve on. So this is, though, an indication that there is, a difference between the ones that did and did not. But there's a lot of confounds there, so not a lot to take away from this. But we are kind of verifying that there is some kind of shift, but not why. So again, this is during quarters where students had access to the decision to do an exam wrapper or not. Now, the other thing that we wanted to check into is the second one, which is a little bit trickier. So what we're looking at here are the aggregate scores and seeing the distributions for students in terms where there was an exam wrapper present. So the more recent set of terms, the last few years, versus the historical data before that point in time. And what we found is that if you actually take and look at the bottom performing students, so the ones that are doing worse, so the ones that did, here's our neutral line. So if we start to look at the population under 1 standard deviation, right here we're at -1.5 standard deviation. So ones that really struggled on that exam, and how well did they do on the final exam compared to the first exam? And we're looking at this again in terms where there was the exam wrapper present. So not even necessarily if they elected to do that or not, but simply to see if it was available to them, compared to historical terms where students did not have it available. They likely would have had a makeup exam or something else available. So what we did see was if we looked at this smaller set of the population where they struggled more, kind of the bottom performers, that there was a statistically significant difference. Now, to look at this statistically, we can pick any arbitrary point in here. It kind of feels like mining for p-values. So rather than doing that, we decided to try to visualize the space of all the different ways that we could look at this. And what ends up happening over here is we're seeing the statistical significance of doing a comparison between these groups. And what will end up happening is we have two things. So we have kind of the upper boundary. So where are we comparing the starting point? So the ones that did 1 standard deviation below, or we could start from 2 standard deviations below or further. And then also looking at the range from, say, -1 to -3, right? So if I go from -1 to -3, all the students that performed at the -1 to -3 on exam 1, and looking at how they did on the final exam, you can see that there's a little bit of indication there of a difference. One of the things that's interesting, though, here is if we look at the sample size, right? If I get really, really small in terms of the range of students we're looking at, the sample size is going to be too small to have a significant difference. So at the top, we have very large numbers, right? From 2 to -5, basically the entire population. So we're looking at the means of the entire groups, which isn't going to have a chance of being anything different because it's normalized, right? So it's going to be 0 and 0. But if we look at what's happening at this lower end, before the population gets too small, so we have enough students to compare, which is why we really need to have, around 1,000 students to be able to have a significant chunk of bottom performers. Then what we see is there's actually this fairly large region where we have strong statistical significance on the differences between the groups. So if we go to kind of the peak point here, looking at -1.5 down to the very bottom of the pack, we have a very, very strong p-value. And so there's this range of students that aren't doing well that end up doing better when they have access to exam wrappers. So hence, reflection for recovery. It's an opportunity for the students that are struggling and need some additional help to be able to make it back in time for the final exam and be successful in the course.
In the qualitative part of our study, we also looked at the responses of the students as to the value of the exam wrapper experience. We broke their responses into 3 parts: time management, whether they grasp concepts, and general QA, as in, were they able to improve the process that they were using in studying and taking the exam. And we felt that this was especially important because this is a relatively beginning course taken by freshmen and sophomores typically. And we wanted them to use this as that opportunity. We found positive results in all of these areas. 69% thought that doing an action plan, for example, actually helped them prepare for the next exam and figure out what they did wrong. So they did better exam prep the next time. So we felt that the lessons learned out of this were, first, that the exam wrappers were useful, and it also is easier than doing makeups for the faculty because they don't have to create a second exam. The students, in doing the exam wrapper, also fix their answers to the exam questions at the same time. And related mechanisms also might be useful, such as post-test surveys and error analysis. We felt that our students learned from the failures by having a tool that would enable doing that. We found that they gained metacognitive skills in performing this activity. And we also believe the early interventions of the exam wrapper were useful in improving their overall performance. We do know that it's tricky to control for all the confounding variables, and the paper covers many of the aspects of those.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, everybody.